Thank you. I think we're good to start now. Well, welcome to our second webinar in our series on the power of population data. This is data of the people, by the people, for the people. This webinar series that we're hosting as the Global Partnership intends to spark interest and also share knowledge on the importance of population data. As you know, population data often is not timely, accurate, or sufficiently inclusive. Neither is it accessible, yet this population data constitutes what we call the foundational data that countries need for efficient planning and delivery of services, also for effective development programming to leave no one behind. Moreover, it's useful for election preparation and also the timely response to disasters. As a partnership, our partners have increasingly articulated the demand for support to amplify the importance of these foundational systems. And through our Leave No One Behind collaborative, we have developed this webinar series. Once again, a very warm welcome to all my panelists and the participants. My name is Bett, and I work as a policy associate with the Global Partnership, and I'm very happy to be the moderator for this webinar. GPSDD was established to help stakeholders across countries and sectors fully harness the data revolution for sustainable development. We work together towards a world where data is being used more openly, effectively, and efficiently. In this webinar, which I mentioned is our second webinar in this series, we will have an exciting discussion on civil registration, vital statistics, and identity management. We would like to use this webinar to understand what these systems are and why are they important. With me, I have an excellent panel to help us break down this conversation, and may I please welcome and introduce them to you. I'll start with Kristin. Kristin Corbett works as a program officer for knowledge translation at the Center of Excellence for CRVs systems at IDRC, in short, the Center of Excellence. The Center of Excellence is a global knowledge hub on civil registration and vital statistics systems. It collaborates with organizations and experts to broker access to information and expertise, including global standards, tools, research evidence, and relevant good practice. My next speaker is Jonathan Maxwell. Jonathan is the Operations Officer at the Identification for Development, in short ID4D, with the World Bank. Jonathan focuses on advancing engagement and support in East Africa and the Asia Pacific. Before joining ID4D in 2016, Jonathan worked for 5 years on identification, civil registration, and vital statistics in the Asia Pacific region. My next speaker is Deidre Appel. Deidre is the program manager at Open Data Watch, who is Open Data Watch is also a partner and a very good friend of the Global Partnership. Deidre is responsible for planning and coordination of work programs activities at Open Data Watch. Deidre holds a master's in global policy studies with a specialization in international development. Last but certainly not the least, may I introduce you to Raj Mitra. Raj is currently an independent consultant, and I call him the CRVs guru. He's also the former chief of demographics and social statistics at the UNECA. So before we jump right into our conversation, it's going to be a 1-hour conversation. I'd like to give you a little info on the logistics for this webinar. For your information, we're recording this webinar and we will share the link after the end of this call. We will also have a Q&A session once we hear from all our speakers. So we're hoping to use the last 20 minutes or so for Q&A. We invite you to share your questions through the chat provision on the tab of your screen all throughout the webinar. And while we would like to respond to all the questions that we receive, we understand that we may not manage to answer all. So we'll aim to choose about 5 questions to respond to in this webinar, but we'll certainly respond to all the other questions as follow-up. At the end of this webinar, I'll have a poll which we're really glad to receive your feedback on how well we did. So this feedback is quite important for us in planning the subsequent webinars. So just to go straight to my speakers, and I'd like to, how I'm going to run this webinar, I'll just pose questions to my speakers and allow them to respond based on their knowledge and experience, and as much as possible giving us examples of their work at the country level. So I'll start with Kristin. Kristin, I'd like you to just tell us what are CRVs systems and why are they important?
Sorry, Karen, thank you. I had to remember to unmute myself there. So CRVS systems are fundamentally a government administrative system. And they're actually two inherently related systems, this civil registration system and the vital statistics system. So just to paint a bit of a picture, civil registration is the continuous, permanent, compulsory, and universal recording of vital events. And by vital events here, we mean at the minimum, birth, adoption, marriage, divorce, death, and their causes. And so civil registration includes not just the occurrence that these events have taken place, so registering the fact that they've happened, but also the characteristics of these through the lifetime of an individual. So for example, you need birth, the fact that the birth has occurred, but also your name, the date that this has happened, and for marriage, to whom have you been married to? Civil registration relies on notifications from other government authorities that have witnessed the event. And so this notification serves as proof that the event has occurred. And from this, the Civil Registration Authority can register, certify, and issue proof of legal identity characteristics. So for example, I'll give a bit of a personal example, but I think many of us can relate to. When my son was born, he was born in a hospital. The hospital notified the Civil Registration Authority. So this is coming from the health sector, but they witnessed this birth. And so they're sending the notification that this birth has occurred. I then, as my son's parent, presents myself to the Civil Registration Authority to register my son's birth. My son is then issued with a birth certificate, which is proof of his name, his age, his place of birth, as well as who his parents are. And as a result, the government has a reliable, trusted legal record that this baby exists, and so they are counted. So my son is now counted from birth. The vital statistics side of the system is that the population data that exists in a well-functioning civil registration system makes this the ultimate source for the production of vital statistics. And so this is very rich data that can be generated, analyzed, and used for government planning and policymaking, as well as monitoring progress against certain activities and development objectives. And so why are these systems so important? They are important both to individuals and governments, and I'm happy to elaborate that as well in a little bit.
Thanks so much, Kristin. And I know, so we're talking about civil registration on one hand, but I'd also want to pass the baton to Daniel. And I want to understand, and I think useful from where you sit at ID4D, what are identity management systems? And again, why are these systems important?
Thanks so much, Karen, for the invitation to join this webinar. To answer your question, so ID systems are everything that's used to capture, manage, and use personal identity data to establish the uniqueness of people, to provide them with identity credentials like an ID card or an ID number, and to facilitate the authentication of that identity. Now, some people would call these national ID systems, for example. It comprises the databases, the business processes, the technology, the infrastructure, the credentials, and also the legal frameworks. There's a key difference between these and CRVS systems. CRVS systems usually are static. They record an event, the occurrence and characteristics of an event. So for example, I'm in Thailand now, but I was born in New South Wales, Australia. My information is not sitting in Thailand, but it's sitting in New South Wales, Australia. ID systems are a bit more dynamic, so they evolve over time. You add biometrics to establish uniqueness. You update the address, which from a statistical perspective helps obviously with using administrative data for population statistics. Now, why are these important? For three reasons. First of all, proving identity and having credentials to do this is often a prerequisite for exercising rights and accessing services. So for example, to vote or to open a bank account, to register a SIM card, and in many cases to access social benefits or to apply and prove eligibility for them. And for women and other vulnerable groups, this can be particularly empowering. For example, women opening a bank account in their own name for the first time. The second reason is ID systems are a foundational platform to improve how services are delivered. So for instance, you can use technology to expand services where you don't need to depend exclusively on brick and mortar offices, but for example, use agents. There's a very useful case from India with the Aadhaar system. Within 6 years, between 2011 and 2017, financial inclusion increased from 35% to 80%. And the introduction of the Aadhaar system played a significant role in that. All you needed to do was have an Aadhaar number and verify a biometric, and you could open your bank account within minutes, as opposed to other countries, for example, where it may take several days and several different types of documents. The third and final reason is that as more and more transactions and more things we do are online, we need to be able to reliably prove who we are online. And what we call this is facilitating trust in the digital economy. Many countries are moving government completely online, or a large chunk of it. There's the famous case of Estonia, where 99% of government transactions can be done exclusively online without the need for a face-to-face interaction. So this saves money, this saves time, and this improves the ease of doing business. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. And I know you touched on key pertinent issues in terms of giving ability to prove identity and rights and access to services. And you also talked about issues about digital identity. I just want to come back a little bit very quickly to you, Kristin. And as you were explaining what CRVS systems is, I'd like to just tell us a little bit more why this is important, and especially seeing CRVS, civil registration, actually as the foundation for us then to be able to have legal identity. So maybe, Kristin, you can take about 2 minutes to tell us the why before I move on to Raj.
Super, thanks so much, Karen. So I think where we would argue very strongly that civil registration of vital statistics systems are a really strong foundation for identity management is that civil registration establishes and closes our legal identities, and it updates this relevant vital information throughout our life course. So by starting at birth and ending at death, we are counted from the beginning of our lives, and we count because we can prove who we are and who our family relations are. And so this is what helps facilitate the issuance of identification credentials that are up to date and accurate in real time. And this is what enables us to exercise our rights and access services such as education, healthcare, to vote, for example. So, for example, having a birth certificate can help prove age for school enrollment or to access healthcare services. And then it certainly facilitates getting other forms of identification needed throughout your lifetime later. So, for example, an adult identity document to open a bank account or get a job or to vote. And then marriage and death registration is so important for families of the deceased to claim inheritance or property rights. So you need to be able to prove that these were your parents, and you need the death certificate to prove that the death has occurred. And so for government, civil registration data is foundational for most other functional databases. And by this, I mean, for example, electoral lists. So it's hugely efficient and cost effective in the long term by ensuring that the data is not being collected in multiple places by multiple agencies. Not only is this very costly over the long term, but it's also subject to errors, and you sort of need to make sure that this data is up to date. It's also legal credibility for the issuance of identity credentials, because the Civil Registration Authority can authenticate that these are up to date and accurate, and they themselves have relied on notifications and proof that these events have occurred from the other ministries or agencies that have witnessed this. So for example, the health authorities in the case of birth registration, or the judicial authorities for adoption or divorce. And banks, for example, can trust the information presented and can turn to civil registration authorities to authenticate these if there are questions. So service providers can focus on service delivery rather than sort of being concerned about being able to trust the credibility of the information. And then vital statistics give policymakers the evidence they need to plan and deliver services. So if the civil registration system is strong, and if it really is universal and up to date, this is an incredibly rich source of data that the Vital Statistics Agency can rely on. And this is especially true since well-functioning systems collect sex disaggregation data at the lowest administrative level, so they know who people are and where they are, and then they can generate statistics in a timely way, so they're not having to rely on censuses or surveys for a picture of the population that they're trying to govern. So I'll sort of pass that back to you, Karen.
Thanks so much, Kristin, and also Jonathan. And I think what we've picked is the importance of CRVS systems and the importance of identity systems. And I know what I've picked from both of you is the importance of these two systems to speaking to one another. And I'd like now to just go to you, Raj. And I know when you talk about linking CRVS systems and identity management systems, we're speaking about adopting what is called a holistic approach. And I'd want to just understand from you, Raj, what do we mean in detail about adopting this holistic approach, one? And I also want to understand why is this really important and what happens when these systems are not integrated. Over to you, Raj.
Thank you very much, Karen, for inviting me to this webinar, very important webinar. I think you're right. We have already started talking about CRV as being the foundation for the national ID systems. But I think the UN Legal Identity Expert Group has, while discussing the legal identity issue, has very aptly dealt with this, what is called the holistic approach. It talks about holistic approach to civil registration of all events, the establishment and maintenance of population registers and identity management apparatus from birth to death. So it's a life cycle approach they are talking about. Production of vital statistics, and there should be full interoperability between these functions in a simultaneous manner, which is very, very important. And the real time that Kristin was talking about, according to international standards and recommendations, and in compliance with human rights of all people concerned, including the right to privacy. So it's a well-defined holistic approach. It's very important to understand that this is a very well-defined holistic approach of ID systems and CRVs. It would be interesting to note that the approach suggests that the population register as a database for identity management. So when you're trying to link with civil registration, it's not about just providing the birth certificate to the identity management. It is actually to organically link it to the identity database. So it's about so population register as the identity management, and that the population register needs to be continuously updated with birth and death registration. Essentially, it means that a child would have to be registered at birth and should simultaneously be included in the population register, provided a national ID number from the national ID system. So it kind of is organic in a way. The ID number of the person also should be automatically retired from the death through death registration and by updating the population register. An organic linkage between CRVS system and a population register will help provide managing a robust, trustworthy, and inclusive national identity management, which is very, very important. Now, what happens if the identity system is not holistic or not integrated? Actually, an unintegrated system runs the risk of not being inclusive, making service delivery on ID system inefficient, and even lead to fraud, which makes the system lose public trust. So it is important that we have a holistic and integrated system. Of course, there are many countries who have already done this or are doing this. We have examples of Botswana. I was recently in Bhutan, which has been able to do this. Or I'm talking of the holistic system. I was in Cambodia, they're already working on it. And then there are a few countries have actually started from birth, and they are also making sure that the identity is retired. And in the process, the pathway to the national identity system in such linked system is through the population register. And one should not forget the importance of vital statistics as an integral part of this holistic system.
Thanks so much, Raj, for giving us in a few minutes the importance. What is the holistic system and where this has actually worked in real countries. I just want to move to Deidre, and Deidre, I'm just picking up from where Jonathan sort of finished in terms of the importance of proving identity and also rights and access. And I know you've been working on some work with CRVs and gender. And I'd like to know from you, Deidre, why are CRVs and identity management systems particularly important for women and girls? And what role can these systems play in our effort to achieve gender equality and meet the SDGs? Over to you, Deidre.
Great, thank you, Karen, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this morning and this afternoon's webinar. So far in the 25 minutes we've been online, we've heard the importance of CRVS systems, we've heard the importance of ID systems, the importance of integrating them, and now we're getting a bit more nuanced on how these systems affect a particular population, such as women and girls, and how they can benefit or sometimes miss out depending on the functioning of these systems. So we can think of the benefits for women and girls on two levels, on the individual level and also on the policy level. So on the individual level, well-functioning systems provide women and girls with documents of empowerment, essentially. So a birth certificate can help ensure children's access to healthcare, to education, even serve as protection against child marriage by proving the age of a child. A death certificate, on the other hand, can empower women to claim widowhood rights and inheritance in the death of a spouse. A marriage registration also can prevent against child marriage in terms of the age and the documentation, but also ensure inheritance rights in the event of a spouse passing to prove that a marriage was in fact intact, or in a divorce. And on the side of a divorce certificate, it allows for a fair access to assets or alimony, allowing independence after a split or a divorce. And as Jonathan mentioned, in terms of the legal identification, this is a document that promotes access to healthcare, financial services, education, voting. So lots of benefits here for the population overall, but specifically women and girls when we're discussing gender equality. So the benefits also go beyond the individual, and this gets to your question about how it impacts the SDGs. So CRVS is a critical source of the data needed to measure and monitor progress towards gender equality, as well as set the policies using that data. This is done so because the systems provide, when they're functioning well and strongly, provide information on population, on birth rates, on maternal mortality, understanding death patterns, on adolescent birth rates. Additionally, it's a denominator for a range of SDG indicators. So UN Women has a list of 54 gender-specific SDG indicators that I'm sure many of us are familiar with. And Open Data Watch looked at the 54 and found that 34 of those gender-related indicators could benefit from CRVS data in some sort of fashion. So we see that it's not only important just for women and girls, but also for the data systems and the data that can tell the stories about the reality of their lives, and also to craft the policies to improve them. Despite all the benefits that we've been speaking about this morning and this afternoon for where you are in the world, the state of CRVS systems around the world are not always in the best situation. So we have more than 100 countries, low and middle income countries, lacking functional CRVS systems. About a third of births around the world are not registered, leaving around 1 billion without legal identity. And only 49 countries produce high quality death data to the standards that we're seeking for, mostly in Europe and the Americas. So there's lots of benefits, but also lots of work to do in terms of allowing these benefits to be actualized. And I'll just close on the fact that there are a lot of dimensions to these biases that can be overlooked. So I'll pause there and hopefully get to speak about some of those in the next round.
Thanks so much, Deidre. And I liked that you started sort of showing us or giving us the statistics on just the number of births and deaths that are registered, and also the countries in terms of the systems that they have. My next two questions will be going to all of you, and I'd like to just also just to know what are some of the common challenges, some of the good practices, also lessons that you have seen in your work with respect to linking CRVs and identity management systems. So I'd like to just start with you, Jonathan, and then Kristin, Deidre, and then Raj. So what are some of the common challenges? What are some of the good practices you've also seen in your work with respect to linking these two systems? Jonathan, please start.
Sure, thanks very much. So in terms of challenges and lessons, I think what I've seen in many countries is, whilst countries want to link these systems, CRVS systems are often well established, or they've been around for a long time, and ID systems would be relatively newer. And so there's a whole range of legacy or legal barriers that prevent the linkage of these systems. So for example, in some countries, the civil registry system is still paper-based, or the business processes may require, if you're registering a birth, marriage, or death, too many steps in which it becomes too much of an issue for people to actually go through the registration process. So if it's not digitized and it's not an efficient system, then it's not in anyone's benefit to link these two systems. And in fact, in many cases, it will be impossible to link these systems. So digitization in particular is key. Also, the requirement of a birth certificate before applying for an ID is not necessarily a good practice. It will create a barrier to the ID system. For instance, it wouldn't be pragmatic to require a 75-year-old woman in a rural area to retrospectively register their birth if they have other methods or means in which to get an ID. And this goes to my first point about processes and systems that need modernization. In terms of good practices, so we've seen in countries like Thailand and South Africa where the ID system is used for a variety of services and is well established in day-to-day life. So families are quite used to using their national ID number, for example. And when a baby is born, they know that it's important to get that baby's national ID number quite quickly. And in both countries, in Thailand and South Africa, they make this process of birth registration and death registration actually very simple. In the case of Thailand, there's incentives also to register the death in a timely fashion. And finally, in terms of those requirements for getting an ID, we've seen in Malawi, in Peru, India, and the Philippines, they all offer good examples of how alternative evidence of identity can be used for registering for a national ID. I'll stop there.
Okay, I'll sort of pick up there because I think Jonathan raised a number of really valuable points, and I just want to pick up on something that he said about the challenges when you have, for example, a 75-year-old woman who, you know, in order for her to get an ID, does it make sense for her to try to be going back to get a birth certificate? And I think that is a real legitimate challenge, and I think we would sort of say that there needs to be a bit of a mixed approach, because in the longer term, it's going to be much more efficient and much more cost effective if births are sort of already registered, and then you sort of don't end up in these circumstances. And so I think it's really sort of solutions in the short term and medium term, but then one of the big challenges is you need that political will for a long-term investment in these systems to get them up and running and work so that you don't run into these circumstances in the future. And as we all know, it's much easier politically to make investments where you're going to see some quick gains, but much more difficult to convince your government to mobilize domestic resources for something that is expensive in the short term, but that has significant long-term gains. And so I think that sort of brings me to another big challenge, is that these systems are complicated in the sense that they require a lot of coordination between a lot of different parts of government. So for example, I was mentioning earlier the notifications that sort of prompt the system. they're coming from potentially the health sector or the Ministry of Justice or from other parts of government where potentially the civil registration system sits in the Ministry of Home Affairs or Interior. And this coordination takes time, and it takes money, and it takes a strategy. And so it's really about making sure that there is a strategy for CRVS systems improvements in place, and that ad hoc investments are not being put into parts of the system at the expense of others. So, for example, a big challenge is, as Deirdre was mentioning, you have sort of very dire death registration rates in some countries. You may have low birth registration, but non-existent death registration rates. You need to invest in both. You need to improve the beginning and the end of the system. You need to look at it more holistically. And so I think one of the big challenges is making that case for investing in the whole system as a systemically. Another big challenge that I would point to is that looking at strengthening the system requires looking at not just the different parts of the system, like birth registration, marriage registration, death registration, and then obviously generating and analyzing the vital statistics that come from that, but it's also looking at the different parts of the system in terms of the demand side and the supply side. So of course there needs to be investment in the government side of the system, making sure that you've got the legal frameworks in place, making sure that you've got trained registrars, all of that piece of it. But it's also about the demand side. You need people to trust the system. You need people to see the value in registering these vital events throughout the course of their life. They need to see the benefit, and so the system needs to be made and set up in a way where people are encouraged to do that. And so some of the good practices that we've sort of seen and heard about, include in some cases having civil registration offices or functions embedded in health facilities, and that sort of streamlines the system and makes it faster and easier, so that you don't have people who are delivering a baby and then having to commute 200 kilometers and pay $20 US, which they may or may not have to actually complete that registration. And so another piece that I would say is a big challenge is legal, cultural, and social barriers. So for example, in some cases requiring the father of the baby to be present in order to register the birth of a baby. And in some cases, that's just not feasible. What do you do if you're a single parent? If the father of the baby is not present at the time of the birth, this just immediately kicks out that baby from the system as a whole and denies them access to civil registration services, but then also later in life can have huge implications. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Karen.
I'll just jump in to take over from there, Kristin. Thanks. So I think one thing that's important to note here, excuse me, is that the CRVS and ID management systems should complement each other rather than compete. And I think the integrated and harmonized CRVS and ID systems can together provide a really strong establishment of personal identity within a country, and when paired together can really work well towards transforming society through ensuring ID for all citizens. But it's certainly not an easy feat. I think, as we've heard from Jonathan and Kristin already, I think it requires a lot of technical know-how, institutional capacity. Legal frameworks are really quite important here, and this partnership across government. But there are some examples and good cases. So in the case of the Philippine Statistics Authority, this was a really great case study that came out of, sorry, excuse me, just have to get a sip of water. Okay, it's winter here in New York, so colds are coming around. So the Philippine Statistics Authority is a really great case study that came out of our Knowledge Brief series on CRVS gender that's produced with the Center for Excellence. And this paper will be in the third brief, which is forthcoming in early 2020. And in the case of the Philippines, the PSA is responsible for the planning and maintaining of the civil registration see that civil registration is integrated much more easily, being housed in one government agency. Whereas when these systems are, far away from one another, successful integration becomes, much more difficult. So this is just one example of a case study. I think in terms of moving forward, having more case studies like these of country examples showcasing the integration of the two systems, the different approaches to how to integrate the two systems, would be really beneficial for this sector moving forward. And from these case studies, I think operational guidelines could be established that showcase how it might be done, covering legal frameworks, privacy and protection of individual data, even advocacy of the benefits and the communication as well. But I will stop here and just note that our next speaker, Raj, actually wrote a paper in brief 2 of this series on this topic exactly. So I'll post a link in the chat now. So it's a really great resource for this particular question.
Thank you. So I would now jump in. In fact, if you look at some of the common challenges, some of them have already been mentioned, so I'm not going to repeat. But the problem, as Kristin has said, is about the death registration. Most of the countries who have even linked birth registration with the national ID are facing the big challenge of death registration itself, because if deaths are not registered, then you cannot retire an ID. You wouldn't even know. For example, of course, India is a different case, because in India, the Aadhaar system has nothing that allows you to go out of Aadhaar. So if you are into Aadhaar, you are there for permanent, because there's no system of taking a link, because it's not linked to the civil registration. India, of course, is now deciding to do another national population register. That's another case. But the other thing I would like to pick up from what Jonathan says, although the CRVS systems are well established, most of them are inefficient in terms of digitization. I mean, they are much less digitized and computerized than the national ID systems, because when the national ID systems are brought into the country, they come with huge investments. And therefore, you have a state-of-art national ID system with good ID cards and modern systems, but the civil registration systems are still paper-based. So you really cannot link these two. So any development of national ID system should always take into account the improvement and modernization of the civil registration system. The third problem I see is creating a stock, because that is where Jonathan was mentioning that when people register into the national ID, it's not always a registration-based system, because some countries, when they create stock, for example, let's say Slovenia, who created the stock of population, and then Bhutan or other countries which already had some legacy family registers could use the family register to build the stock of population. And then they try to link with the ongoing civil registration system. But there are so many countries which are trying to build the stock from the voters registration system. Like Malawi, it did a voters registration system. So it starts from 16 or 18 and above. Now the struggle is to how do you manage 0 to 17? So they're going to go for a campaign mode to do 0 to 17. There are other countries which go through a campaign mode. So they would give a window of opportunity to everybody to register, which probably India is going to do very soon. So creating a stock is a big challenge, and there is really no good guidance on this. So that's very important. And this is a perennial question that needs to be addressed. And I agree. I mean, birth registration is complicated. Death registration is even complicated, because if you go to Bangladesh, or even I was in Cambodia, you cannot register a death of a person unless the birth of the person is registered. So if a person has died, you actually have to register the birth of the person to get the death registration done. So these are the problems that have to be addressed. And when you're talking about business process, you don't talk of business process anymore about civil registration as a separate business process and ID system as a separate business process. I think the whole business process should be developed in a very holistic and integrated way. And finally, I agree, there are legal challenges, there are institutional challenges. I'm not saying many countries like Uganda, Nepal, which have now started moving, changing the institutional arrangements to bring national ID and civil registration. Actually, Uganda has already done it. Nepal is in the process. but many countries have successfully integrated the civil registration and national ID functions under one department, actually under one director or one DG. But in some cases, like Kenya, there are two different departments within the same ministry. So these are institutional things that we have to manage, and also coordination. I'm not saying that if they are within the same ministry, there will be good coordination. There can still be bad coordination. And in fact, if they are in two different departments, then can still be a good coordination. And then finally, legal challenges. I think we have to think about a law which again sees how data from civil registration and national ID are shared, and how the civil registration will be able to update the national ID database or the population register database. And finally, there is lack of global guidance, as Deirdre has pointed out, and it's so that is extremely, and capacity is an issue. We'll talk about it in the last section. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, all of you, on your feedback and practical examples of countries where this is working. I'd like to now move to the last question for this webinar, and maybe before I move to that, I'd just like to inform participants that we have a Q&A section. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask the panelists, please drop them in the Q&A and we'll focus on them. And then also that we have a poll that has gone live for your feedback towards the end. And so just coming to my last question for today, and I'd like to know from all of you, my speakers, what more do governments and also other actors, including development partners, need to do to advance this conversation on a holistic approach on integrating these two systems? And also, what plans does your institution have to take this agenda forward? I'd like to invite Deirdre to go first, and then Jonathan, Kristin, and then we finish with Raj. Over to you, Deirdre.
Great, thank you, Karen. So I'll take this from the perspective of other actors, including development partners, as ODW, Open Data Watch, is a civil society. But I think for this topic in particular, the phrase power and partnerships is especially relevant and important. I think advancing the conversation in a holistic way, as we're talking about, especially on CRVS gender or CRVS and ID, really requires a range of perspectives and experts around the table. As we dig deeper and deeper into some of these issues, it's really a topic that spans beyond just statisticians or civil registrars, and really requires gender experts, demographers, even anthropologists who understand culture within a country and how that affects these systems and the functioning of them. ID specialists, of course, even child rights and anti-child marriage advocates as well. It's really a broad group of stakeholders that should be involved with some of these conversations around solutions. And one thing I'll note is that I think that this is increasingly important as we begin to think about not only CRVS systems functioning in, the status quo, but also in an age of migration, refugees, humanitarian crises, etc. So again, moving the conversation forward to understanding how the systems function within these different contexts, and how vulnerable groups especially might be at risk of being left behind or uncounted when we're talking about public health emergencies, natural disasters, armed conflicts, etc. So I think more research and knowledge generation around that area as well could be really beneficial. So in terms of what we're doing to advance this holistic approach, the Center for Excellence and Open Data Watch are working together to host a 2-day conference on CRVS gender in February 2020. And we're doing just that in terms of practicing this power of partnerships to bring a range of stakeholders together to discuss a lot of these issues, from interoperability to social norms to conflict. So we'll have registration details online shortly, so definitely stay tuned for that early next year.
So from my perspective, there's 7 steps that the governments need to take. So first of all, as Raj and I think Kristin mentioned, is to have a stock and flow approach, right? So simultaneously introduce your ID system, but also at the same time strengthen the civil registry and digitize it. The second step is to coordinate between the relevant agencies and ministries. And I agree with Raj that they don't have to be in the same department of the same ministry for it to work. But of course, that can often help move things along, as it did, for example, in Indonesia, but also to coordinate with other stakeholders. The health sector is obviously important in the context of births and deaths. And I'm sure in each country, there's a range of other stakeholders that need to be coordinated with. The third step is to digitize. So digitize the ID and the civil registration systems so that you can actually have that real-time interoperability and data exchange. The fourth thing is to adopt open standards and open design. If you have systems that are locked into a particular technology or vendor that prevent the sharing of data or to prevent any changes made to the IT systems, then that integration is a non-starter. Then adapt best practices and international standards. There's lots of international guidance out there, but of course these need to be contextualized for where they are being used. Incentivize, create positive incentives for people to actually register and provide their information. And seventh and finally is protect. So ensure privacy by design and data protection in terms of what data is collected and how it's shared and what is shared. And on this point, I just want to elaborate a little bit that unfortunately, civil registration systems, many of them collect too much data. And when a system is used for an administrative or identity purpose, this data, for example, religion or ethnicity, which may be useful from a statistical perspective, for example, to disaggregate the data, if it's used for identity purposes, this can create new opportunities, new privacy and discriminatory risks. So it's very important to be very precise and adopt the principle of data minimization in terms of what data goes back and forth between the systems. On the World Bank side, we have more than $1 billion invested in both civil registration and ID systems around the world, and that includes several projects with the Global Financing Facility for Every Woman, Every Child. This includes high-profile projects in Nigeria, Somalia, and Rwanda, where we're actively investing in the linkages, but also strengthening the respective systems. And also we're advising countries like the Philippines. Last, I'd encourage you to look at our ID4D practitioner's guide. There's a whole section on linking civil registration and ID systems that would explain this. I'll send the link in the chat. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Yes, I think from our perspective, some of the things in terms of the question of what more needs to be done, I think, on the one hand, there needs to be continued advocacy and momentum around making the case for why integrating or linking CRVS and ID management systems is so important, why CRVS systems are such a powerful tool in terms of providing the foundation for ID management, but also for legal, it's the sort of legal underpinning of ID management, and it when done well, it sort of gives that legal underpinning, but it's also a trusted source of issuing identification credentials, and I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. I think we also, on the one hand, it's the importance of linking these systems, but then on the other hand, it's the how. And I think there needs to be real openness to documenting and sharing practices and having governments connect with each other to understand how they've managed to do things, because as it was mentioned earlier, very few countries have nothing in place. There's already something in place. So how do you work with those existing systems and make them stronger? And so on this, it's a bit of a plug, but the Center of Excellence for CRVS Systems and the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, we've launched a compendium of good practices in linking CRVS and ID management systems. And I've just shared the link through this webinar, but it's available if you go to crvssystems.ca/ID compendium. And it's not meant to be a prescription by any sense of the word. It's very much a compendium that features 6 country case studies, and it's 6 countries who have done things very differently. They've all started from completely different legal and administrative realities, and it's just a showcasing of different experiences, and this will be the subject of the conversation. We'll do a bit of a deeper dive in the next GPSTD webinar, which will take place next week on the 12th. I think what's also really a sort of challenge where more needs to be done is research evidence on what are the costs in the long term of not investing in CRVS systems as the foundation for legal identity management, because committing domestic resources is really difficult, and we sort of talk about how it's so important and is needed for sustainability, but I think real evidence and some concrete numbers to help make the case is really important. And so that's a piece of work that we are working at the moment with the Swiss Tropical Health Institute and trying to get a better sense of what this picture actually looks like. And so hopefully we'll have some interesting findings early in 2020. I think there's also a need for evidence around solutions. So we obviously know that countries, what are the barriers to registration in some countries, and not just birth registration, but also marriage and divorce and death registration, and having implementation research that really identifies the bottlenecks and addresses these directly, I think is a really important missing piece. And then obviously, it's identifying the expertise and making sure to connect that expertise with countries or partners who are looking for that, and sort of really sharing experiences. So I think that's sort of what I would add to the conversation.
Thank you. I think most of the points have been covered, and since I don't come from an institution, I don't have an institution perspective. So what I can talk about is picking up from what Kristin just mentioned about advocacy, because the first thing you need to do is to get a political commitment to a holistic approach. So an understanding, a clear understanding of what it means and what it takes to do it, and what are the benefits of doing it. Although there are already a lot of documents which have come out thanks to World Bank, but I think it has to be a more systematic approach to advocacy. Although the regional commission, the ECA, had in its recent ministerial conference used this as a theme, the identity and civil registration, and I'm glad to know that ESCAP is also taking it up as a theme for the 2020 ministerial conference, and this will be certainly helpful in advocating for a holistic life cycle approach. And I'm also glad that finally the UN legal identity team, along with the World Bank, have getting to the point of defining the legal identity, because then it brings everything together to look at a holistic system. So I think that's important. Of course, putting in place, because even if before you start linking, you really need to understand how it will work institutionally, what will be the organizational arrangement. Because there can be 2 departments, 1 department, this we have already discussed, and the legal mechanisms. Is there a guidance on how to develop a legal identity system legal framework? Because you may have a legal identity at time of birth, but later on there may not be any law to do the identity system. So I think a comprehensive identity civil registration law, I'm not advocating for it, but there are countries which may do it, but there are countries may keep it separate laws, but then they can define the interoperability between these 2 systems. But it's very essential that the law makes that case, makes sure that there are provisions of interoperability. Otherwise, only from the civil registration side, if you say you want an interoperability and the national ID doesn't, then there is a problem. And I think more and more guidance documents are needed. If you look at the civil registration, you have the principles and recommendation. It started from 1953, and Jonathan made a mention of it, that it is well established. They also had 5 documents, training documents. They had documents on legal identity. They had, a legal framework, communication, and all that. So I think there has to be more guidance, and finally more technical assistance. Now, who goes for technical assistance? where is the global expertise on understanding the whole system? So I think there is a need to build a pool of global experts, regional experts, who can support in technical assistance, because I'm sure many countries will require technical assistance in near future. So that's all. I only had one issue about minimization of the data collection and civil registration. I agree that sometimes the civil registration form is so overloaded that it can be still minimized to a great extent. But I think the important point is, I don't think any statistics that is collected in civil registration has to go to the national ID database. It can directly go to the vital statistics compiling office, and we should not burden. Like he's right, ethnicity should not be going to the national ID database or the civil registration database, but it may be required to. For example, in my country, any data without ethnicity, statistical data without ethnicity has no meaning at all. It's not politically accepted. So I think it's very important to understand that. So the business process of how statistics will flow, what will flow, how much will flow, has to be well defined, well organized, and a good business process has to be developed around it, and the legal framework and the institutional arrangement. Thank you so much. I'll stop here.
Thanks. Thanks so much. I know we're coming to an end, or towards the end of the webinar, and I think it has been a really rich conversation. It would be unfair if we don't respond to some of the questions that we've received from the participants. And I think just because of time, I think we can answer 3 or so questions, and I'll pass, I'll of course read out the questions, and then I'll pass to my panelists to give maybe a one minute answer. And I'll start with your question, Neil. I think you're saying that the UN strongly believes that investments in the identity ecosystem in any country should equally focus on registration of births and deaths, which is what we're calling the CRVs systems, and also the registration of living adults. So in other words, CRVs and identity systems should be clearly linked. But in your view, there appears to be a prevalent view in the identity management part of the identity community that while birth and death registration are important, they're simply not as important as registration of adults in an ID management system, and that registration of adults should take precedence. So I think what you're saying, Neil, is it appears that identity of adults is taking more priority compared to the registration of births and deaths. And while from your institution you disagree with this view, I think I'd like to check with my panelists whether do they agree that investments to these two systems should be equally distributed. I think for the panelists, you can jump right in responding to Neil's questions. Raj, please go ahead.
No, I think it's right. I don't know whether it's equal distribution, but I think it requires the civil registration and national ID systems should require equal attention, not unequal attention, because you create a database of adults through whatever means, through a means of registration, continuous registration, like you keep on adding people to the population register or the national ID register, because one has to distinguish between the national ID register and the population register. I'm not saying they are two different, but if national ID register becomes a population register or vice versa, when you start from birth and then end in death, because in some countries the national ID register, like Bangladesh, it starts from age 16, right? And the birth registration has no linkage with national ID. So, but still it's a national ID database. But what I'm trying to say is, therefore, it's important that equal attention is paid, and because you can register all the adults and continue to do it for years to come, but then you won't be. So every time you want to provide any service to children, say population below 18, then you will not be able to do it. So it's important that you start linking from age 0. And secondly, there is always this issue of fraud being committed between age 1, age 0, and age 14. So I think it's very important. And then the death registration. You know, in India, a lot of direct cash transfers happen through Aadhaar database linked to the bank ID. And now if people die and if the Aadhaar doesn't know about it, the bank is continuing to transfer money to their database, to their bank account, sorry, the government. And you will only come to know only when the life certificate is given. Or maybe if there are two corrupt persons at the local level, the bank and the person who is getting the benefit would never declare the debt and keep on getting the benefit. So I think the linkage has to be understood not only from the technical point of view, but also from the possibility of building trust in the system, because tomorrow if it's something breaks out, the government will lose face. So I think it's important to remember that these two have to build simultaneously, and you cannot have a system of civil registration which is manual and a very sophisticated national ID system. So I think when you talk about building national ID system, you should also build the civil registration system. The investments have to be done on both systems, perhaps from the same source, and not two different people doing two things, two different agencies.
If I can just add, so I fully agree with Raj that it's not about equal budget, because we're talking about two very different systems, particularly if you're doing a mass registration that involves a lot of human resources and logistics, compared to the CRVS system, which is a continuous data capture system. But certainly it's about equal attention. And I have to say that I think the issues do get equal attention, and certainly from the World Bank's perspective, they do. And in terms of investments, about a third of our investments are directly in civil registration and vital statistics. Plus there's more of that, in addition to that, that goes into building the institutions like the shared agencies and the linkages. So I think there's a lot of resources and attention towards that. But I think where there is often a challenge is within countries. For example, when a Ministry of Finance is making a decision on where to put their money, they're obviously looking for a return on that investment. And if we compare ID, for example, where there's financial inclusion, there's plugging leakages in cash transfer programs, there's very clear, obvious, and documented evidence of the economic and social impact. Whereas for CRVS, I think there's less of that. And Kristin mentioned earlier, doing research on the cost of inaction. I think that's an extremely important thing to do, because when we go to a Ministry of Finance and say, you want an ID system, but you also need to build a civil registration system, they say, well, why would we need to do that? And often the best business case we can give them is, if you don't invest in your continuous birth and death registration, then you're going to have to build a new ID system in 10 or 15 years, which will cost you, so much more compared to the investments in the continuous birth and death registration.
And I'm just going to hot pursuit on that, Jonathan, because I agree, and I think this is a real problem. And I think the danger, to Neil's point, the danger of sort of investing in one system over the other, we really need to look at this as a longer term solution, because otherwise, as Jonathan mentioned, we will sort of continue to have to reinvest in these systems over and over and over again. And in the long term, that's incredibly inefficient and ineffective and very costly. And I think another sort of point to why investing in CRVS systems as that foundation is so important is the evidence that these events have occurred, that by investing in civil registration, the civil registration system by design is relying on notifications as proof that these events have occurred by the authorities that have witnessed them. And I think that's a really important thing for all of us to remember, because to Raj's point about the risk of fraud and sort of security problems, how easy is it to trust a system if I'm only sort of registering my existence for the first time as an adult? I can reinvent myself. And I really think you need sort of that trust-based, evidence-based system that has the legal backing. And it is an overwhelming thing to invest in, particularly at the beginning, but I really think we as the community need to ramp up our evidence and advocacy for why investing in these systems in the long run is so important.
Thanks so much. I just want to jump into the second and last question. And what I've done, I've combined your question, Daniel and David. And I think the question, and I'd like to pose this to all my speakers, starting with you, Deidre. ID systems seem to be premised on good technological infrastructure, including the most recent hardware and robust applications, together with good card production. Civil registration, on the other hand, is more of a social science, which deals first and foremost on events and people. Don't you think this variation affects the push for a unified system, given the legacy approach with which these two areas have been viewed? And I think what David is also keen to understand is, so we're talking about modernization, digitization, improvement, and we're using these concepts interchangeably. And I think he also wants us, as responding to technological infrastructure, are we talking about the same thing when you're saying modernization, digitization, and improvement? So I'd like to start with you, Deidre, and then I'll pass to you, Kristin, Jonathan, then I'll finish with Raj.
Sure. So I'll take this question more from the civil registration side, as that's where a lot of our work is. It's certainly, I would say, more of a social science in terms of dealing with events, people, customs, cultures, etc. And I think in terms of the modernization, which we talk about, I think it is interchangeable with the idea of digitization of the CRVS systems. Just the fact that a lot of systems might still be paper-based is a huge barrier to getting to this next step of linking the two systems. I think also in terms of this point around a social science, and I'll bring it back to what I had mentioned earlier in the hour about the different gender dimensions of the systems. And I think this also bleeds into ID systems as well. And it's not that, you know, there's not an effect for ID systems, but for CRVS, I think that there are a lot of barriers or biases that can exist for women and girls. Kristin had talked about it before in terms of limited geographical access, having registrars quite far away, a complex or expensive process, even, you know, discriminatory laws in terms of having requiring a father's name on a birth certificate, et cetera. And I saw another question from Dial Communities on you know, reaching some of these uncounted or more vulnerable to being left out of the systems question as well. And I think that this comes back to another theme around incentivizing, whether you're talking to a government official on why this is important, or whether you're talking to an individual on why registering a birth is important. This idea of making the case and advocating for a better functioning of these systems, a better integration of these systems is really, really key. So I'll stop there.
Sorry, I didn't remember who was next, but I'll jump in. No, I mean, I think, well, the question sort of speaks a little bit almost to the danger of investing in sort of a digitized ID system at the expense of strengthening a CRVS system, because it does become more difficult to integrate them and have them work together. And it does make them two very separate systems rather than having an ID management system that sort of relies on the civil registration system as the foundation. I mean, I think there's a danger in trying to rush digitization if the legal processes aren't in place, if the coordination and the sort of business processes of your civil registration system are not properly in place. Digitizing a bad, sort of inefficient, ineffective system is not going to make your system stronger. So I think there's sort of a time and a place for when that piece needs to come in, and I think this is sort of where CRVS systems assessments and strategic planning processes are so important, because I think that's sort of where digitization needs to be thought about. At what point do you bring that in? And so I think there's just more my sort of gut-wrenching fear when you sort of work to digitize a system that's not strong is that not only is not sustainable, but it actually is hugely dangerous in terms of data privacy and protection, and if the systems aren't well thought through first. So I'll sort of leave that as my short answer for now.
So
yeah, sorry. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, I just want, I'll be very quick. I want to very respectfully disagree with the premise of Daniel's question, which is that civil registration is more of a social science than ID. Even today, I was dealing with a country that are debating whether to put a third gender in their ID system, for example. And the same issues about registration and usage of the ID system and privacy, these come into play. But he raises an important point in the sense that as has been mentioned a few times, CRVs is a well-established field with lots of standards and recommendations, whereas ID is nascent, and certainly there's very different interests involved in ID, and so when these two fields converge, there is some tension, and I think that's important to recognize. On the issue of modernization versus digitization, I have nothing to add to what Kristin said. It was perfect. You shouldn't digitize before you modernize. So modernize means reducing the steps, making it easy for people to do things. And that should be the fundamental goal, first goal that CRVs and ID practitioners have.
I think I have nothing more to add, and I agree with all that has been said before me. And Jonathan actually stepped in and talked about this social science issue. I think it also applies to national ID. When you come and register, it's also it's about social science. The digitization is a tool to. You see digitization because you have the technology of fingerprint. You believe that it's more modern than the civil registration. So civil registration can be equally modern if you need to have it. And it's very important what Kristin and even Jonathan said. You see, Bangladesh is a classic case of a registration system fully digitized. I'm not saying modernized, fully digitized since last 8 years. The registration levels are still 20%. So it's not about digitization. Digitizations don't solve problems. I think it's about modernization, making things easier for people to register, making law easier, making making it more accessible. You asked for 10 records, 10 types of documents to register a birth. I saw in Cambodia, you need the birth certificate and of the father and the mother to register the child certificate. Where will the birth certificate of the mother and the father come from? Then you need a marriage certificate. Then you need this, you need that. This is not a modern system at all. You need to be the fact of it's about registering a fact of an event at a particular place on a particular day to a particular set of people on a particular address. That's all. We have made this very, very complicated. So it has to be modernized, not only in terms of digitization, but also in thinking process. Okay, I'll stop here because we are across.
Yeah, well, I wish we had more time. I wish we had time to continue this conversation and this debate. But well, thank you so much to my speakers. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I've really enjoyed moderating, and also thank you to my participants for your rich questions. If we have not responded to all the questions, I'll ask that all the panels respond to each and every one of the questions. Just as I wind up, I'd like to invite you to the second webinar, which we'll be hosting next week on the 12th. And in this webinar, we'll have a deep dive conversation on countries, looking at case studies of countries that have actually adopted a holistic system in integrating the CRVs and ID management systems. So I'll be sending around more information on that shortly. And just to say once again, a big thank you to my participants and also a big thank you to my speakers. Thank you very much. Good morning from where you are, good night where you are, good evening, depending on where you are in this world. Thank you very much.